Okay, we will take care of it, but let's begin. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bצלאל Salon number 5. My name is Ori Sukari, and I'm a lecturer in the Visual Communication Master Program as well, and a member of the Teaching Center of Art and Design in Bצלאל. I'm excited and super thrilled to be here this evening, hearing our next guests. But before introducing her, I wish to thank several remarkable people who, without their assistance and support, none of this would have been possible. So I wish to thank Moran Zarchi, Ori Yakutiel, Barak Pellman, Liאת Brixet-Gar, and Merav Salomon from the Bצלאל Art and Design Teaching Center. Please mute yourself, mute your microphones, press the presenter view button on the top right-hand side. And if you have any questions during this talk, please write them in the chat. We will try to ask as many of them as time permits. Hosting this conversation and introducing our next guest this evening with me is Dr. Liät Lebיא, the head of Visual Communication Master Program in Bצלאל. Liät, good evening.
Good evening, Ori, and thank you. I'm extremely honored and delighted to introduce our guest for tonight, Professor Shoshana Zubov. Professor Zubov is a Harvard professor, a scholar, and writer whose research and writing spans social psychology, economy, technology, and political philosophy. Her original and thought-provoking ideas have made her a prominent voice in deciphering the profound impact of technology on our present and future societies. She is the author of several books, including The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. The book, published in 2019, has already drawn immense attention, and I will not be exaggerating if I say that it is reshaping the discourse in the field, through its original terminology becoming an essential framework for addressing some of the most pressing concerns of the 21st century. Thank you, Professor Zubov, for being with us this evening. We're truly honored. Where are you at the moment?
I am in Maine, northern New England, United States of America, in the country.
And also
where I
in
live.
And many other places virtually. So I would like to open with some general questions about your research and your book. For our audience who might not be very familiar with your work. So in your book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, you describe our age as defined by the extreme surveillance techniques employed by corporations such as Google and Facebook, and point to the way that they use our data to predict and manipulate our behavior, what you define as the shift from monitoring to actuation. Could you give an example of this phenomena and its implications?
Yes, okay. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Liät. And I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Of course, I wish I could be in Jerusalem and we could all go out for a drink after a talk. But unfortunately, right now, we have to forego those joyful aspects of life and make our joy in some new ways. So thank you for having me here tonight. And I'm very excited to hear your questions and your thoughts as we move through this hour. So let me give you just a very brief sketch of some of the key concepts so I can answer your question, Liät, about this shift from monitoring to actuation. Okay. Let me see if I can do in just a couple of sentences, what is surveillance capitalism? Capitalism evolves by taking things that live outside the market, bringing them into the market, turning them into commodities that can be sold and purchased. Surveillance capitalism operates in this way. But in the 21st century, in the first years of the 21st century, where this economic logic was first invented, it discovered a kind of dark and startling twist for this old logic. And that twist is what it takes from outside the market dynamic to turn into a commodity is us. Specifically, it claims our private experience as a zero cost asset. Why zero cost? Because it takes without asking, which is another word for stealing. So it takes our private experience without our knowledge. Our experience is translated into behavioral data. Those data fill many different kinds of supply chains. This started in the online environment, trying to get enough data for targeted advertising. But now these supply chains are literally everywhere in our lives. You want to get the test results from the doctor's office. You want to get the homework from the university office or the grades. You want to make plans online with your friends and family for dinner. Every single thing you're doing, walking through the park, walking down the street, walking through the shopping area, everything you're doing is a supply chain interface for these data flows. So now surveillance capitalism works off these complex ecosystems of supply chains. And where do all these data flows go? They go to the 21st century factory, where they are made into products. But this is a computational factory, and the products are computational products. Specifically, they are behavioral predictions, predictions of what we will do soon and later at the individual, the group, the population level. These predictions are sold into a new kind of marketplace that trade exclusively in these human futures, the way we have predictive markets that trade in pork belly futures or wheat futures or oil futures or whatever it may be. Now, a little bit of insight into this. A couple of years ago, a leaked Facebook document. We learn a lot about surveillance capitalism from whistleblowers and from leaked documents, invaluable. So a leaked Facebook document gives us a little bit of insight into this process. It talks about its AI hub, the center of its computational factory, where it describes trillions of data points being ingested every day and 6 million predictions of human behavior being produced every second. That's the kind of scale. All right, now let's move from monitoring to actuation. When you're feeding AI like this, and the goal is to produce certainty, right? Then the question is, what are the competitive dynamics for these companies that are trying to sell certainty? Well, the first thing is, and I think everybody recognizes this, you know, artificial intelligence wants a lot of data. So the first imperative we have is economies of scale. As competition intensifies, they discover scale is critical, but it's not enough. We also need variety. We need different kinds of data, not just what people are doing online. We've got to get them out of the office, off the keyboard. How do we do that? Oh, I've got a good idea. Let's make a tiny little computer. We can call it a phone. They can put it in their pocket. They can take it everywhere. Now they're out in the world, and we'll call it mobile because that sounds like a good thing. So out in the world, now we can get everything. We can get their faces wherever they may be. We can get the way they're walking. We can get their gait. We can get the stoop of their shoulders. We can get where they're going, where they've been, where they are, who they're with, what they're talking about, what they're eating, what they're buying. It becomes almost unlimited. So that's varieties, which is to say scope. Now we have economies of scale and economies of scope. As competition continues to intensify, they discover, the most predictive data come from actually intervening in the state of play, actually learning how to tune, herd, modify people's behavior to push it in the direction that satisfies their predictions, that optimizes, therefore, their revenue flows. This is what I call economies of action. How do you modify human behavior at scale? This is a new kind of discipline. We haven't seen this before. There have been people who dreamt it. but it was never possible to actually bring into effect. This mirrors, to go back now to Liat's important question, this mirrors an arc that data scientists talk about. They talk about the arc from monitoring to actuation, which, if you're a conceptual thinker, this is also the same arc from knowledge to power. Because what monitoring means is you've got systems, automated systems, which are monitoring and therefore constantly developing information, understanding patterns of a given machine system. That's the context in which it is normally discussed. You get to a critical mass of knowledge about the system, and that critical mass allows you to go over the tipping point so that you not only can monitor the system, you can actuate it, which is to say you can control it. You can control it remotely. You can control it automatically because you have enough understanding in order to be able to have, algorithms that create these possibilities for remote control, keeping things within parameters and so forth. We shift from monitoring to actuation of machine systems. But now when we move to economies of action, we're talking about human systems, and we're talking about learning the art and science of how we not only know, but also can shape and control human behavior at scale, monitoring to actuation. Voila. I'll stop there and let you ask me more questions, or I'll keep talking and that won't be good.
It's fascinating, and we're all benefiting. I was wondering, as you were speaking about this shift and about this power that you often exemplify through economy and through capitalist or economical interests. But it seems that once at the end of the chain, there is a human being who owns the company. There is someone at the tip of the pyramid. And what happens if they have ambitions that go beyond profit, that are political, for example?
Well, we have an unusual situation when you talk about ownership and its convergence with leadership. Silicon Valley is an unusual situation. It's not only Silicon Valley, but mostly. This began with Google. When Google went public in 2004, the founders carved out a very unique way of organizing the shares. And not to get into the detail, but just to give you the result. The result was that the founders control the voting shares. So that gives them a degree of control that really is quite unusual, because even though in America, within our jurisprudence and justice system in America, a private company does not come under the constraints of the United States Constitution. So it has degrees of freedom that an entity in the public sphere would not have. But so what we rely on as a counterpoint is what's called corporate governance. The idea that there are boards that have fiduciary and other kinds of responsibilities, that there are shareholders that have opportunities for voice and action and so forth. Well, beginning with Google, there was no corporate governance to constrain them, because these two young men, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, essentially had all the authority, and therefore they also had all the power. So a very unusual situation where the way things developed, that's another part of the story if we want to get into, how surveillance capitalism was allowed to develop for 20 years with hardly any law to constrain it. That's an interesting and important topic. But because that was the case, we ended up in the case of Google with, these two young men, they're not so young anymore, who literally have control of the way the world's information is organized. They essentially, have control of the web. So that is not only insane, but also deeply intolerable and deeply repugnant, especially in the context of a democratic society. When Facebook went public, Mark Zuckerberg organized a similar kind of stock deal for himself. And so there again, we end up with this highly unusual situation. One young man, he's not so young anymore, but one young man who has complete control over what has become essentially a global communication system without law or corporate governance to constrain it in any way. So, Liat, you ask a question. Does this make society vulnerable? Does this make democracy vulnerable? The answer is absolutely yes. And that's why I'm fighting every day in my writing and in my speaking to raise our awareness and to mobilize our understanding. Because in my reckoning, we've had 2 decades of lawlessness and unaccountable power. And now we enter the 3rd decade of the digital century. Don't forget, this was supposed to be the century that was the most democratic, because the digital was going to democratize and liberate. And that's not how it's turned out. My view is that we now have the 3rd decade to turn this around. The 3rd decade is the decade in which we have to mobilize the charters of rights, the new legal frameworks, the new regulatory paradigms, and the new institutional forms that actually can make this digital world and our digital future a place that is not only safe for democracy, but that amplifies and advances the democratic prospect. That is our big work now.
Yeah, I would like to ask about that. First of all, I was thinking, for example, you were talking about legislation within the United States, for example, but I was thinking also about, for example, Clearview AI selling its technology to non-democratic states, for instance. And the understanding, I think, that the realization that state legislation will not do. We need international legislation and supervision of these technologies because they are very mobile. And so I would like to ask about this, about the international need for legislation. I would also like to point out or ask, I think one of the good success stories in the history of mankind, not perfect, but not too bad, was with nuclear power that had horrendous results, but then the international community realized that it must be governed very closely. And so is it the case that for the international community to unite around this cause, we first need a Hiroshima, or we first need a more robust realization that this technology is putting democracy in danger, or could we get there without a 3rd World War?
Well, these are questions that I ask myself every day, and no one has the answer to this question. But the answer is that this kind of question is essential for us to be discussing. The way I've been thinking about it is that, well, okay, let's talk about the international dimension of this a little bit. We have begun to see, that when I said before, new charters of rights and new institutional forms, I'm thinking very much about the international dimension. Human rights are not, when we consider what are inalienable human rights, we don't consider them on the basis of, you know, for my country, we consider them on the basis of humanity. At the same time, we understand that, you know, what I've just said to you about advancing the prospect of a digital future that is that also advances democracy. If we look to the East and we look to China and the Chinese Communist Party, they have very intentionally, at least since 2010, been grasping this point very, very acutely. And they have not only envisioned and conceived and understood, but they have designed and they have executed an approach to the digital that advances the Chinese form of authoritarian government. And not only has their surveillance technology and the capabilities to implement and operate and manage those technologies for authoritarian ends, not only has that been the domestic policy, but that has also been their foreign policy. So, you know, we can count at least 36 governments that have looked to China for the importation of extensive surveillance technologies and the training personnel, the management personnel, the AI personnel, and so forth, who are going to, you know, help local law enforcement and local military deploy these systems in favor of political authoritarianism. So, so the fact that that is already in play is all, you know, this is a feature of our international landscape. And so while it has been a difficult thought and an unpopular thought for the last many years, you know, it really raises the question of, in the short to medium term, do we really have to drive for an alternative vision of the digital, including the internet and its successors, that is wholly a democratic environment, and wholly amplifying and advancing democratic principles and aspirations, and that over time, that would, in my belief, over time, that would become the dominant paradigm, because that, of course, is, you know, where people want to be. But it may be that in the short and medium term, we have a, you know, we have a more variegated strategy. But okay, so comma. Having said that, we already have the beginnings of international bodies who are committed to, you know, that international perspective. I compare it, Liat, to the idea of child labor laws. You know, in American labor history, when the idea of legislation to make it a criminal offense to employ children in factories, when that idea was first produced, it was being implemented on a state-by-state basis. And people quickly understood that if you're going to keep children out of factories, it can't be done on a state-by-state basis. It has to be federal legislation. And so we're in a similar kind of situation. But we do have the International Grand Committee on Big Data, Privacy, and Democracy. They began with about 10 parliamentarian representatives from countries around the world. It's now close to 20. They have led the in-depth investigations of Cambridge Analytica. They have worked closely with parliaments in different countries. At the end of 2019, we had our first US congressperson who joined the international committee. So for the first time, we had American representation there. And they are doing powerful work. I was a witness at the Ottawa meetings last May. And what impressed me was going around a growing table of the members of this committee, how erudite they were, how much they had studied the subject, you know, how deeply entrenched they were and passionate and clear-minded. And they were not anywhere near some of the things we've seen on TV with the congressional hearings, you know, where you see legislators being bamboozled, you know, just led around by the ear by the likes of a Mark Zuckerberg or an Eric Schmidt.
I'd like to make it, I'm still on the pessimistic line now.
Yeah.
I want to point out that, for instance, nuclear energy hasn't changed much. The technology hasn't changed much since its inception. And child labor, the legislation is rather simple. Either you do or you don't. It's a binary, more or less kind of thing. I myself also a lawyer. And I know that legislation, the process of legislation, the details, it's a very, very slow process, whereas technology is evolving very, very fast. So is it even possible for us to make up for the 20 years of the gap? Is legislation a good enough tool to stop this trajectory?
Well, you know, that's why I say new charters of rights, new legal frameworks, new forms of regulation, but also new institutions. So, you know, look, the way I think about it, if we were, and again, forgive me, but I'm kind of using the American historical perspective here because it's the one I know best, but I think the analogy is clear. If we were standing right now in the year 1930, where the society and economy was still dominated by huge and violent monopolies, where the American judicial system still was deciding almost every case of workers' rights on very narrow grounds of property rights. So there's a vast body of judicial opinion that kept accruing to the owners of capital, the monopolists themselves, and making it very difficult for workers to have legitimate rights to organize, to bargain, to strike, all the things that became absolutely essential to create some kind of balance of power ultimately between capital and labor. So if we were standing on the and every institution, well, not every one, but the majority of institutions that we have relied on in the 20th century, except for the last few decades where some of these institutions have really been scraped. But even now, with the COVID unemployment, you know, we're turning to things like institutions of employment on insurance that were invented back in the 30s. So we're still relying on those institutions. So my point is that it was really during the 30s that we had this huge paroxysm of fertility, new legal formulations, wholly new kinds of institutions that were put in place to protect workers, to protect consumers, to create a balance of power. Had it not been for the creative work of that decade, if we were making predictions about the future on the shoulders of 1930, we'd be looking ahead to a purely oligarchic, monopolistic century of a few companies and the families behind them owning all the wealth, and great populations of essentially industrial serfs. That was not the history of the 20th century. We did create a working class. There was, for many decades, a substantial balance of power between capital and labor. So my view here, Liat, is that the past 2 decades, we have not even been trying. Democracy has essentially slept through these 20 years. And that's largely because 9/11, 2001, speaking from the vantage point of Washington, D.C., the entire perspective toward the internet and commerce on the internet changed 180 degrees. Even in the months and days leading up to 9/11, if you were in DC on Capitol Hill, the debates were about privacy. And the debates were about, do we need and how extensive should it be privacy legislation, federal privacy legislation. There was already a growing understanding that the fledgling internet companies, the internet industry, as it were, was not going to be able to regulate itself. That changed on 9/11. The new theme was total information awareness, and it was based on this new mania, this new obsession for total certainty and therefore total information, that the attitude towards Silicon Valley changed entirely. And now these became very valuable little young companies that Washington wanted to nurture, wanted to allow them to flourish, wanted them to develop these nascent surveillance capabilities that they were already creating, because the agencies in Washington, the intelligence agencies, Defense Department, and so forth, understood that they were going to need those data flows. They were going to need those data flows, and the only way they were going to be able to create those data flows was in the marketplace, in the private sector, outside of U.S. constitutional oversight. So, so that is what I call the unwritten doctrine of surveillance exceptionalism. It helps account for why these companies have had pretty much of a free run for the last 20 years, unregulated, very little law to impede them. We're paying the price now, but now is the time that we mobilize and we act. We still have a long digital future ahead of us. And if we could turn that around in the 30s for the 20th century, I believe we can do that now for the digital century.
Thank you for that optimism. I'm going to carry it with you. We're going to take a question from the audience. From
great.
And she wrote, Dr. Leah Friedman wrote, surveillance capitalism is based on the fact that most people want to be watched over and looked after. The very notion of discipline, as Foucault examined it, assumes the compliance of individuals, the gaze of the community. Can one demand of the various digital systems to draw a clear line between tracking and surveillance?
Well, you know, I have a slightly different interpretation of this. People talk a lot about, you know, the word convenience, and that everybody wants convenience. Convenience comes with the tracking. With the tracking comes the personalization. With the systems comes the ability for things to be smart, and sort of the general view goes that people really want convenience, and so they fall for these things, they accept these things. I've talked to groups of people, to groups of people who I really believe should know better. And when we get to this conversation, they say to me, wait a minute, Shoshana, you're not going to take away those targeted ads from me, are you? You know, I really like those targeted ads. So, let me tell you my response to this. Number one, I think that people love convenience because for the past 5 decades, perhaps most pointedly in the US and the UK, where neoliberal ideology and economics, you know, have really had their way, with our societies. The lives of ordinary people in our societies have become extremely fraught and extremely stressful. You know, we've seen the hollowing out of the middle class, redistribution of the labor share to different parts of the world. We've seen the flattening of real wages, so that, you know, everybody in the family is working. In many cases more than one job. Lives are under time stress. They're under economic stress. Everything has become more competitive. Getting a child into a childcare facility has become competitive. Into a school, being able to afford something in a safe neighborhood. Everything has been scraped. People's lives have been scraped to the bone. There's so much stress and anxiety that under these conditions, of course we want convenience. It's not just that we're, you know, we want to lay back and have somebody fan us and do our manicure. It's that we are already pushed to the wall, and anything that can help us, that can save some time, that can get something done for us that I don't have to do myself, these things have been welcomed because we really are scraped to the bone. So I have a lot more sympathy for people who have allowed these systems to enter their lives. Here's where reason number 2 comes in. Why is this called surveillance capitalism? It's not to be dramatic or melodramatic or romantic or theatrical. It's for one very specific reason. If these systems are not hidden, they do not produce wealth in the way they have. In every study that's been done since early in the century, what we see is that when people actually are told, are allowed to understand what the systems are doing, what they're taking from them, what knowledge about them they're taking without asking, and therefore without awareness, and therefore you know, really challenging our notions of freedom and choice and autonomy and agency. When people learn about these systems, they invariably are upset, they're angry, they want to know how to disentangle from those systems, they want to know how to hide from those systems, how to camouflage themselves. So there is a rejection, and that rejection means friction, and friction means less revenue. So, these systems from the beginning have been designed to keep us ignorant. And that ignorance has also allowed us to sort of lull ourselves into these defense mechanisms and to say, well, you know, I'm just giving them a little bit of data, and in return, I get this convenience, and I know it's not cool, but you know, it's a calculation I'm willing to make because I just really need this time saver. The ignorance has prevented us from understanding that the concentrations of information and the concentrations of knowledge that are now being accrued inside these companies, these are vast concentrations of knowledge, only a little bit of which come from what we knowingly tell them, what we knowingly say, what we knowingly give, what we knowingly share. The vast majority, those trillions of data points every day, the vast majority of that is what they take without our knowledge, without our awareness. And so that's really where the trouble lies. Liat, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to make up a very condensed question that builds on, first of all, Liat, who asked the question, Liat Friedman, has insisted that she's not speaking about convenience. Okay. And I would like to connect that also, but rather I think that the core issue or the core thought is that privacy is one value, maybe a very important one, that could be measured with others, and relies on our basic human passions. But there are also other passions, for example, wanting to be cared for, or there was actually a book by Yuval Karniel and Amit Lavidinu, who argued that in fact the concept of privacy has lost its value actually in the 90s when the reality TV showed up, and suddenly we stopped caring about privacy and started caring more about fame or about exposure, about the way the community looks at us. So the shift is not necessarily a shift of a trade-off between convenience and privacy, but maybe more basic, more foundational desires. And that I would also like to connect to what's happening now with COVID-19. We are all being surveyed now more than ever by our governments, and recently by the General Security Service here in Israel. And many would say that this is justified because, okay, we're losing our privacy, but we're saving lives. So what would you say about that? You've also said, it's a very long question, you've also said that privacy is crucial because a society that cherishes privacy is a society that cherishes human experience and democracy and freedom and autonomy. So do you think that privacy is simply one of those values that we could not let go of, no matter what lies on the other side of the equation?
Okay.
A lengthy one.
All right, let's see how we do this. All right. Going back to Liat's question, convenience. You know, when I say the word convenience, I was kind of riffing off your word care. You know, the idea that someone's caring about me, caring for me, figuring out the things that I need, supporting my needs. So in my view, that kind of felt domain has been summarized in the, you know, in this field very frequently with the word convenience. And I'm suggesting that what a lot of people talk about as convenience really relates to this underlying need for care that we have because our lives have become so pressured. But I'd add a second dimension to that, and this refers back to the reality TV phenomenon. The way I understand that is recognition. Not so much that I crave fame, but that I crave recognition. And I crave recognition to the extent to which I'm being born into a society that doesn't welcome me, that doesn't care if I'm here or not. So I've written a lot about this, but not in a long time. But the idea, I've seen this develop in America over these past few decades in a way that I find really heartbreaking. And that is, you know, a child comes into a community and immediately the attitude is sort of, you know, what have you done for me lately? Like, you have to compete in this, you know, are you a good student? And what school will you get into? A good school where you can make enough money, where you can get a decent job, where you can have a place in society. You know, that your welcome into society is not tacit, it's not implicit, it's not unconditional. You have to prove yourself in this life competition. And probably in the United States of America, in American culture has been more like this than other societies for possibly a couple of centuries, but never as grossly and intensely as it is now, where everything is reduced to its market function. So you choose, college, which is, school, something, the closest thing to my heart. College means co-legere. We read together, which means, we make sense together. We create meaning together. The most important experiences for becoming an adult. But now college is about, how does it translate into a salary, which is an abomination and a grave disfigurement of what education is all about. So, which I'm sure there aren't too many people in the audience that are going to disagree with me on that. So, so this craving of recognition, we began to see this. I began to really see this so loudly in American society. I would say going back to the 80s, when this ideological shift really took place. I don't, I live in the country, and where I live, there are still intact communities, more traditional small town communities. And I will say that the people who live in these communities where you're born and you have a place, you don't have to make, $1 million a year, or you don't have to have a stock portfolio to have a place. You have a place. Your place in your family, in your community. And folks who live where I live really have very little interest in being online or being tracked or anything else. So, that's maybe a little bit of a sort of substitute for historical control groups. But anyway, so that's with respect to recognition. Do we crave that recognition enough to forfeit the right to privacy? My reading of all the information on this is no. And indeed, if the answer were yes, then what we're seeing happening with COVID and technology would not be nearly as contested as it is. It might not be contested at all. If it was really true that we didn't care about privacy, in every country at this point, there are really, energetic discussions going on about, is this contact tracing app that's coming from this public health authority or that public health authority, is, what kind of data is it collecting? How much of the data are inappropriate? What's going to happen with these data? Will these data disappear when we're in a post-pandemic modality? I mean, what is going on? And people are sufficiently upset about that around the world because those bonds of trust that existed in a pre-9/11 world, have really been eroded by that doctrine that I've mentioned to you. Surveillance exceptionalism has forfeited the kind of trust that we had in our government, in many of our government institutions, and now we're learning, including our public health institutions. And that's a great tragedy, because public health institutions in a democratic society, which operate under the rule of law and under democratic governance, have a legitimate need to understand the wider pattern of disease and how it migrates, because that influences their strategies for impeding it and eliminating it. So there is a deeply legitimate function here. But we need social solidarity in order for public health authorities to exercise that function. And the only way we're going to have that solidarity is if we have the laws that make citizens feel safe about the ways in which the digital is going to be deployed and data are going to be used. So you see this cycle that we're in. finally, privacy and the public. Look, privacy is an effect, not a cause. If you're thinking about the causal chain here, privacy is a good that comes at the end of the causal chain. The causes of the effect have to do with things like the sanctity of human autonomy. When we talk about a democratic society, we assume many things about the kinds of human capabilities that are required for a well-functioning democratic society. And those human beings are people who can think critically, who have some kind of internal gyroscope of moral values, moral compass, who understand the difference between expedience and principles. These capabilities are impossible to separate from the underlying facts of human autonomy. People who can think for themselves, who don't just join a mob, who that's what the right to vote devolves to the individual, because we believe that the individual has these autonomous mental and moral and judging capacities. So autonomy and brings us choice and self-determination, and those things allow us to choose whether or not in any given situation or with any given aspect of our lives we want to choose privacy, or we want to choose transparency, or to what degree, where we want to place ourselves on that spectrum. Privacy is a choice, and the choice is only ours if we are aware of what's going on, so we can exercise autonomy, so we can exercise self-determination, so we can make choices and have privacy. So in this sense, I believe that if we pull on the thread of privacy and we say privacy is negligible, we've sort of bought into the propaganda of the surveillance capitalists. They want us to believe that privacy is this narrow domain that's just about, you just give us a little bit of data and, we'll hold it for you. Don't worry about it. Sign on the dotted line. And then you get these great free services and we make your life so much easier. And, what's the problem? As long as we contribute to these systems, these are systems that ultimately, going back to economies of action, these are systems that ultimately produce systems of social control. We happily and joyfully post our photos on Facebook, right? Because I want to show my folks or my grandparents or my cousins or my friends who live far away. So all the family photos, all the personal photos go up on Facebook. Those are the photos that are taken by Microsoft for its data training set for facial recognition in the wild. Those are the photos that are taken by Clearview. All of these facial recognition systems that are built on the strength of our Facebook photos and all the photos that we post innocently throughout the web, and all the photos that are taken of us on the street through devices and cameras in the park, in our neighborhoods, in the cafe, because the companies have fought for the right to take our faces wherever they appear. Our faces are highly predictive data because they betray our emotions, and emotions are highly predictive. Okay, so every time that we are just innocently participating, we are allowing them not just to take what we give, let's have dinner tonight, but they're taking everything else that we have no idea they're taking. And that's what's feeding these systems. So ultimately, Uyghurs who are imprisoned by facial recognition systems in Xinjiang those facial recognition systems have become so powerful in part on the strength of our family photos. This is why I say privacy is not private. Privacy is public. We're contributing to public systems that are anti-democratic and fundamentally oriented toward social control.
Okay. I've been getting cues from Ori that our time is almost up. We have time for one last question from the audience. I must
yes,
say,
please.
The time flies when you're having fun, and I could go on afterwards. So it's really just the beginning. Ori, do you want to ask the question, or should I?
No, you go. I'm without my glasses.
Okay. Okay, so we have this question from Elisa Goichman, who's a Bצלאל graduate. And she writes, so connected to life-saving, not to discard the dangers, hypothetically, could the capability of these data exploiting systems to steer humanity be also valuable considering the radical and global shift that is needed when it comes to the looming environmental catastrophe?
Absolutely. So I'm so glad. What's her name? What was
Elisa.
Edita. Edita, I'm so glad. What? Did you say something? Oh, Elita. Okay, Elita. Excuse me. I'm so glad you asked this question because this really is, you know, in Spanish we say the punto clave. This is the heart of the matter. Okay, so what makes the situations that I have described to you so intolerable is that we need the digital. We need the data. I want to show you something. Where do I have that here? Okay. All right. This is a piece of paper that is a very expensive piece of advertising real estate. It's the back cover of the New Yorker magazine. And Google purchased this back cover, very expensive real estate, in order to tell us all the ways it helps us, okay? There are 17 reasons listed here. Probably can't see them too well, but I'm just gonna randomly close my eyes and point to the list. I'm just gonna give you 3, okay, out of the 17. So, all right, number 1, get a deal on a flight. Number 2, find a 4-letter word for assist. Number 3, take better pictures at night. Most expensive real estate, Google could say anything it wants for how it's helping us. And these trivia is how it chooses to use that opportunity. What is the point? The point is the surveillance capitalists, and by this I mean Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. Apple is a mixed case. It's got 1 foot in and 1 foot out. It is not entirely innocent, so I'm going to add it to this list. Those 5 companies have literally cornered the world's supply of machines and human capabilities for artificial intelligence. They've got the data, right? They've got this vast global, all those supply chains I'm talking about. They've got the data, and so I call that the means of production, but they also have exclusive abilities to make sense of the data. I call that the production of meaning. They've got both. Okay, so what are they using it for? They are using it to advance their own financial objectives in their own narrow markets, where they're predicting our behavior to business customers who want to leverage that knowledge for their own financial outcomes. So there is nothing on this list about using these continents of data and analytic capabilities to solve the climate crisis, or to flood the world with smart and loving teachers and doctors, or to rid the oceans of plastic, to cure innumerable diseases. That's not anywhere on this list. So this is why I say we have to make the digital ours. We have to take the control of the digital future. And when I say we, I mean democracies. I mean, we need these capabilities as democratic societies to improve our lives and to turn this century back into a century of hope, of flourishing, of renaissance, of moving beyond the fears of climate cataclysm, of moving beyond the diseases that are scourges in every part of the world, the hunger and the unnecessary disease, the lack of educational access, every single thing. But we need to do it as democracies under the rule of law. And when we do it that way, we can participate. We can participate with a full heart and with full trust, because we decide who knows about me. We decide how the data are used. We decide so we can make sure that all these data are used for good and not for incarceration, not for unfreedom, not for anti-democracy. That's exactly why we need a digital future that advances the democratic vision.
I'm really sorry that you can't see all the questions we have in the chat and answer them all, because we're getting amazing questions from the audience who is very engaged and intelligent.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
Commenting. Not sure if we have time for another question, Ali? Is our moderator?
Well, you just asked, yeah, really tiny one.
Maybe we spoke.
Is there such thing as a tiny question on your list?
Yeah, you both can do that.
It's going to be really, really okay. Modest, a very tiny question.
Okay, very modernist. Let's try.
I would like to just ask you for the closing of this discussion, how do you see the place of artists and designers within this?
That's the perfect question for us to end on, and it is minimalist in a way. Look, I spent more than 7 years writing a long book about everything we've been discussing. One of the happiest things that has happened to me in the past year and a half since the publication is the response that I've had from artists. So I've had groups of, I've had theater groups write original plays based on the book, including youth ensembles in different parts of the world, writing original plays. Another theater group that readapted Kafka based on the book. I have had music, electronic music, rap music, hip hop music, whole albums dedicated to the themes of this book. I have had artists sending me these extraordinary pictures of their pictures, whole exhibitions that people have been doing, inspired by the themes of this book. Filmmakers. So here's what I know. I know that the threats that we face, come to us through our bodies. They come in our experience. Sometimes in this book, I write in the first person. I tell little stories in the first person. And people have said to me, you're a scholar, you're an academic. What are you doing writing in the first person? I did that specifically to invite my readers into feeling something, not just reading words and thinking it, to feel something with my feeling. So we need art. We need art of every sort. We need visual art. We need dramatic art. We need stories. We need narratives. We need every kind of art. We need music, because it's through that that we come to the deeper level of realization of what these systems mean for now and for the future. What kind of world will they create for us? What will we lose when it becomes too hard to turn back? You began this question asking me about violence and revolution and war. And it's conceivable that there will come a time when it will be very difficult to turn back. Not impossible, but very difficult. In the way we had to go to war against totalitarianism, very difficult to turn back, at great sacrifice. So I don't want us to get to that place. Obviously, no one does. So before it gets too late to turn back, we need to mobilize people in their hearts and in their bodies, as well as with their brains. And art is the key to all of that.
That's a beautiful answer. The best there is.
Amazing. Thank you. Liאת.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Professor Zubov, for the generous and insightful answers and your passion. It's been really an absolute pleasure. And we'd love to have you visit us once it's possible.
I can't wait.
Now we're gonna have people who'd like to do that open their mics to clap. And wonderful.
Clap for you. Thank you all so much.